The rain came down in relentless sheets, drumming against the rooftops and flooding the narrow streets of Hendersonville. The once gentle ripples of Mirror Lake had turned into chaotic waves, thrashing against the docks and swallowing anything unlucky enough to drift too close. The storm had arrived with an unforgiving force, bending trees, rattling windows, and forcing most of the town indoors. But David Carter wasn't indoors. Hunched over his handlebars, he pedaled furiously down the nearly deserted streets, his jacket soaked through despite the hood he had pulled tightly over his head. The newspapers tucked under his arm were mostly dry, shielded beneath plastic, but he was more concerned about getting home before the storm worsened. He had promised his mother he wouldn't stay out late. Lightning split the sky above, a jagged flash that illuminated the world for a fraction of a second. In that brief instant, David saw it, just ahead, past the curve near the lake. A pair of headlights. A car was moving too fast, its tires skidding across the slick pavement. The sedan veered wildly, hydroplaning as its driver tried, and failed, to regain control. It swerved off the road, slammed into a fallen branch, and plunged down the embankment, straight into the lake. David's breath caught in his throat. He skidded to a stop, nearly losing his balance as his bike fishtailed against the wet gravel. For a moment, he just stared, frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Then the panic hit. Oh, God! The car's nose dipped into the water, its back end jutting up for a moment before it began sinking. The headlights flickered, distorted by the rippling lake. Inside, through the rain-smeared windows, David could see the driver, a man, trapped inside. He didn't think. He dropped his bike and ran. His shoes slid in the mud as he bolted toward the edge of the lake. His heart pounded in his chest, his pulse thrumming in his ears. The car was sinking faster than he had expected. "Somebody help!" he shouted, but the wind carried his voice away. He turned his head frantically, searching for someone, anyone who could help. That's when he saw Ryan Reed. His best friend was on the dock, fishing rod in hand, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding behind him. "Ryan!" David yelled. "Get over here, now!" Ryan looked up, startled. When he saw the sinking car, his fishing rod hit the dock with a clatter as he bolted toward David. "What the hell?" Ryan skidded to a stop beside him, his eyes wide. "Dude, what? There's someone inside!" David was already yanking off his sneakers, his fingers fumbling. "We have to get him out." Ryan hesitated. "Are you crazy? That water's freezing." But David wasn't listening anymore. He took one deep breath, then dived in. The icy water punched the breath from David's lungs the moment he hit the surface. It was like slamming into solid stone, his body instantly engulfed in numbing cold. The shock sent his muscles locking up, but he forced himself to kick, push forward, keep moving. The car was sinking fast. Water was already up to the driver's side window, the headlights casting eerie beams through the murky depths. Inside, the old man, James Hayes, was struggling, pounding against the glass, his face a mask of panic. David swam hard, reaching the driver's side just as James tried, and failed, to undo his seatbelt. The man's hands were shaking, his breaths coming in frantic bursts. David pressed his fingers against the glass. "I'll get you out," he yelled, though he knew James couldn't hear him. A splash from behind. Ryan had jumped in. "David, the door won't open until the pressure evens out. You have to break the glass or wait." David didn't have time to wait. He searched the lake bottom with his hands, his fingers brushing over a jagged rock. Good enough. With all his strength, he swung it against the window. The first impact cracked the glass but didn't shatter it. James's eyes widened in renewed panic. David pulled back and swung again. This time the window gave way with an explosive burst. Cold lake water rushed in, filling the car. James let out a muffled, strangled sound as he gasped for air, fighting against the current pulling him down. David reached in, his fingers finding the seatbelt buckle. His lungs burned, his vision blurred. He fumbled, tugged. Finally, the belt snapped free. James was weak, his movements sluggish. David wrapped an arm around him, pulling him through the shattered window. The car disappeared below them, swallowed by the lake. David kicked upward, dragging James with him. His arms screamed from the effort, his body slowly losing the fight against the freezing water. Then, a hand grabbed his shirt and yanked. Ryan, together, they broke the surface. James gasped violently, sputtering water, his grip on David weak. "I got him!" David coughed, barely able to keep his head above water. "Ryan, get us to the dock!" Ryan nodded, wrapping an arm around James's other side. The two boys swam, half dragging the older man between them. It felt like forever, every stroke burning, the weight of James pulling them down. Finally, they reached the shallows. Ryan was the first to scramble onto the dock, then reached back to help drag James and David out of the water. James collapsed onto his back, wheezing, his body trembling uncontrollably. David dropped beside him, his own chest heaving. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then James reached out, his fingers barely brushing David's sleeve. His lips moved, his voice a weak, rasping whisper. David leaned in. James whispered something David couldn't quite hear. Just 2 words before his eyes slid shut. The sirens arrived moments later. The sirens grew louder, their wails cutting through the stormy night as emergency vehicles skidded to a halt near the lake. Flashing red and blue lights reflected off the water, casting eerie shadows across the soaked dock where David, Ryan, and James lay gasping for breath. Paramedics rushed toward them, their voices urgent but slightly muffled by the ringing in David's ears. His body ached, his limbs felt like lead, and his skin burned from the cold. But his mind kept replaying those last 2 whispered words from James. He couldn't make them out, couldn't shake the feeling that they meant something important. One of the paramedics knelt beside James, pressing 2 fingers against his neck. "Pulse is weak but steady," he called to his partner before glancing at David and Ryan. "You boys okay?" Ryan nodded, still breathless. "Yeah, just cold." David barely had the energy to respond before someone grabbed his arm. His mother. "David!" Anna Carter's voice was sharp with panic, her fingers clutching his soaked sleeve. She was still in her work uniform, her name tag from the diner glinting under the flashing lights. "Are you hurt? What were you thinking? Jumping into the lake like that?" David opened his mouth, but his voice came out hoarse. "Had to. He was drowning." Anna exhaled, pressing a hand to her forehead as if steadying herself. "You could have died, David." "I didn't." Before Anna could say more, the paramedics lifted James onto a stretcher. His face was pale, his body limp except for a faint twitch in his fingers. As they wheeled him toward the ambulance, Lily Hayes stepped into view. She was tall, her sharp features framed by long, dark hair that was slightly damp from the rain. She wore expensive boots that splashed through the puddles as she moved toward the stretcher, her expression unreadable. But there was something in the way she hesitated before reaching for James's hand, like she wasn't sure if she should. "Lily," one of the paramedics acknowledged her. We need to get him to the hospital. You riding with us?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes flickered toward David, studying him as if seeing him for the first time. "You're the one who saved him?" David wasn't sure what to say to that. "Yeah." Lily exhaled, nodding slightly before climbing into the ambulance beside James. The doors slammed shut, and within seconds, it was gone, sirens fading into the night. Ryan nudged David with his elbow. "Dude, you just got sized up by a millionaire!" David barely heard him. His mind was stuck on James's whisper. He needed to find out what those words meant, and the only person who could tell him was now in a hospital bed. The wind had died down, but the rain still fell in a steady drizzle, soaking into David's clothes as he stood there watching the ambulance disappear into the night. His heart was still hammering in his chest, but it wasn't from the cold anymore. Something about the way James had looked at him before passing out, the urgency in those whispered words. He couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something. But what? "David." His mother's voice cut through his thoughts, this time softer, less panicked, but no less firm. "You're coming home. Now." She didn't leave room for discussion. He knew that tone, the one that meant there was no point in arguing, but he wasn't ready to just walk away. "Mom, I need to go to the hospital. I need to talk to him when he wakes up." His voice was steady, but there was a tightness in his chest. Anna frowned, crossing her arms. "David, you've done enough for one night. You nearly froze to death pulling that man out of the lake. You need to rest. You're not running around town chasing answers to something that probably doesn't even matter." "But it does matter," David insisted, frustration creeping into his voice. "He said something to me, Mom, right before he passed out. 2 words. I don't know what they were, but they felt important." Anna sighed, rubbing her temple. "David, it's the middle of the night. He was probably delirious. You saved his life, that's what matters." David clenched his jaw, biting back the argument on the tip of his tongue. He knew his mother wasn't trying to shut him down just to be difficult. She was scared. He had scared her. But that didn't make the feeling in his gut go away. Something about all of this didn't sit right. Ryan, who had been standing quietly next to him, finally spoke up. "Look, Mrs. Carter, I'll make sure he gets home after we swing by the hospital. I promise. No dumb stunts. We just want to make sure the guy is okay." Anna shot him a skeptical look, then exhaled, clearly realizing there was no winning this argument. "Fine. But you're coming straight home after. And if you so much as sneeze tomorrow, you're staying in bed all day, understood?" David nodded, relief washing over him. "Got it." With that, Anna turned and walked back to her car, shaking her head as she muttered something under her breath about stubborn boys and near-death experiences. As soon as she was out of earshot, Ryan grinned. "Dude, I can't believe you actually convinced her." David wasn't in the mood to celebrate. His mind was already racing ahead, thinking about what he would say to James, if he even woke up tonight. "Come on," he said, already heading toward Ryan's truck. "Let's go." The hospital wasn't far, just a 10-minute drive from the lake, but the ride felt longer. The rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers and the distant rumble of thunder were the only sounds between them for a while. Ryan kept glancing at David, probably waiting for him to say something, but David was too lost in his own thoughts to start a conversation. When they pulled into the hospital parking lot, David was out of the truck before Ryan even turned off the engine. He didn't wait, didn't hesitate. He walked straight into the lobby, the sterile smell of disinfectant and 2 bright fluorescent lights, making his head swim for a second. The nurse at the front desk barely glanced up. "I'm here to see James Hayes," David said quickly, shifting on his feet. The nurse, a tired-looking woman with graying hair, sighed. "Family only." David hesitated. He wasn't family. He barely even knew the guy. But before he could say anything else, a familiar voice spoke up behind him. "It's okay. He's with me." David turned. Lily Hayes stood there, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She had changed into dry clothes, dark jeans, a fitted black coat, but her face still looked cold, distant. He had the odd feeling that she had been expecting him. The nurse gave her a brief nod before motioning toward the hallway. "Room 214. He's stable but still unconscious." Lily didn't say anything else as she turned and started walking, expecting David to follow. He hesitated for only a second before falling into step beside her. "You didn't have to do that," he said after a moment. Lily didn't look at him. "I know." They walked in silence, the only sound the occasional beep of monitors and the distant murmur of doctors and nurses. When they reached room 214, Lily pushed the door open without hesitation. James lay on the hospital bed, his face paler than before, a nasal cannula feeding him oxygen. His hands were still bruised from hitting the window, his fingers twitching slightly even in his unconscious state. David took a step forward, suddenly unsure of himself. He had felt so certain that he needed to be here, needed to know what James had said. But now that he was standing in front of him, he didn't know what to do. Lily broke the silence first. "You're not just here to check on him, are you?" David glanced at her, caught off guard by the way she was studying him. "He said something to me, right before he passed out. I don't know what it was, but it felt important." Lily exhaled through her nose like she had already expected that answer. "James has a habit of holding on to secrets. Maybe he finally decided to let one go." David frowned. "What do you mean?" Lily didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over to her father's bedside, staring down at him like she was searching for something, an answer, a sign, a connection that had been lost years ago. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost reluctant. "My father and I haven't spoken in nearly 20 years, she admitted. "Not since my brother, Michael, died. I left this town when I was 17 and never came back. He never asked me to." David swallowed. He had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone in town had. James Hayes had once had a son who drowned in Mirror Lake. "You think this has something to do with Michael?" Lily's fingers curled into a fist at her side. "I think James has spent years avoiding the truth about what happened that night. And if he finally decided to say something, you might be the only person who heard it." David looked back at James, his mind spinning. He didn't know what those 2 words had been. But suddenly he knew one thing for sure. They weren't random, and whatever they meant, they had something to do with Michael Hayes. David's mind wouldn't stop racing. The hospital room felt too quiet despite the steady beeping of the monitors, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. James Hayes lay motionless in the bed, his breathing steady but weak, his hands still twitching slightly as if grasping at something unseen. David stared at him, at the man who had nearly drowned hours ago and who had whispered something that refused to leave his mind. 2 words. Something important. Something connected to Michael. The realization made his stomach twist. Everyone in Hendersonville knew the story. James Hayes had once had a son, and that son had drowned in Mirror Lake. That was the reason he had shut himself off from the world. why he had abandoned his woodworking shop, why he had barely been seen outside his house in years. But David had never thought twice about it before. Until now. Lily stood on the opposite side of the bed, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She hadn't spoken much since she had let him into the hospital room, but she hadn't asked him to leave either. That alone told David that she had questions too. Questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Finally, she broke the silence. If you're expecting him to wake up and explain everything, you might be waiting a long time. There was no sarcasm in her voice, no bitterness, just a calm, detached certainty. David glanced at her. You think he won't wake up? Lily exhaled, shaking her head slightly. I think my father has spent so long running from the past that even if he wakes up, he won't tell you anything useful. He doesn't talk about Michael. Ever. David studied her for a moment. There was something careful about the way she spoke, like she was trying not to let too much emotion slip through. But there was a tightness in her jaw, in the way she kept glancing at James, but never for too long. David wondered if this was the first time she had seen her father in years. He said something to me before he passed out, David said finally, choosing his words carefully. 2 words. I couldn't hear them clearly, but it felt important. Lily's lips pressed together, and for the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Hesitation, maybe. Uncertainty. And you think it had something to do with Michael? It wasn't a question. David nodded. Yeah. Lily was quiet for a long moment. Then, without another word, she reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and tapped the screen a few times before holding it up to her ear. Who are you calling? David asked, confused. My lawyer? Lily said simply, as if that answer explained everything. David blinked. You're what? Lily ignored him. She turned away slightly, murmuring something into the phone too low for him to hear. David exchanged a glance with Ryan, who had been silent up until now, but was clearly just as lost as he was. A minute later, Lily hung up and slipped her phone back into her pocket. When she finally looked at him again, her expression was colder, sharper. You want to know what my father said to you? Fine. But you should understand something, David. David swallowed. What? If it was about Michael, she said, then you're not the only one who's been waiting for answers. David felt a chill creep up his spine, and it had nothing to do with the lingering cold from the lake. Lily's words carried a weight he hadn't expected, a quiet but undeniable intensity. She wasn't dismissing him. She wasn't laughing off the idea that James had whispered something important. She was taking it seriously, maybe even more seriously than he was. And that meant something. Ryan shifted beside him, arms crossed, watching the exchange like a spectator at a game he didn't quite understand. David barely noticed. His focus was locked on Lily, on the sudden shift in her demeanor, the way her gaze had sharpened with something just beneath the surface. Curiosity, suspicion, or maybe even fear. So what now? David asked carefully. You called your lawyer. Does that mean you think this is bigger than just a couple of words? Lily hesitated, and for a moment David thought she wouldn't answer. But then she sighed, running a hand through her hair. I don't know what I think, she admitted, and for the first time, there was something almost vulnerable in her voice. But if my father said something to you about Michael, then I need to know what it was. I left this town 20 years ago because I thought I knew everything there was to know about what happened to my brother. And now, suddenly, there's a chance I don't. David glanced at James, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. He looked so small lying there in the hospital bed, so different from the man David had known only as a quiet, distant presence in town. A man people whispered about but never approached. A man with a past no one questioned. Until now. "You think he's been hiding something?" David said slowly, piecing it together. "Something about what happened the night Michael died." Lily exhaled, her gaze darkening. "I don't know. But I do know that my father has spent 2 decades pretending Michael never existed. He never visited the grave, never spoke about him, never let anyone bring up his name. And now you're telling me that in what could have been his last moments, the one thing he did was try to say something to you." She shook her head, her voice tightening. "That doesn't make sense, David. Not unless there's something more to it." David swallowed hard. He had felt the same thing since the moment James whispered those words. That inexplicable, gnawing feeling that he had stumbled into something much bigger than himself. That James had tried to tell him something he had spent years keeping buried. And if Lily was right, then it wasn't just guilt or grief. It was a secret. Ryan, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke up. "Okay, let's say there is something more to this. What do we do? Just sit around and wait for him to wake up?" Lily's expression hardened. I don't wait." David raised an eyebrow. "Then what?" Lily reached into her pocket again, but this time, instead of her phone, she pulled out something small and metallic. It took David a second to realize what it was. A key. "This was in my father's coat pocket when they brought him in," Lily said. "I recognized it immediately. It's the spare key to his woodworking shop, the one he closed 20 years ago and never set foot in again." David's pulse quickened. "You think whatever he was trying to tell me is in there?" Lily met his gaze, unwavering. "I think there's only one way to find out." David glanced at Ryan, who let out a low whistle. "Okay, so just to recap, guy nearly drowns, whispers something weird, and now we're about to go snooping through his abandoned workshop in the middle of the night, like we're in some detective movie." David gave him a look. "You don't have to come." Ryan scoffed. "Are you kidding? Of course I'm coming." Lily didn't waste another second. She turned, heading for the door without another word. David followed, his heart pounding faster now, but this time it wasn't from fear or uncertainty. It was from something else entirely. Anticipation. Because whatever they were about to find in that workshop, he was sure of one thing. This was only the beginning. The next morning, David woke up with a dull ache in his muscles, a reminder of the night before. His body was exhausted, but his mind was restless, replaying every detail of the rescue, every word Lily had said, and most of all, the last thing James had whispered before slipping into unconsciousness. He had hoped that by morning, things would start making more sense. But if anything, he felt even more tangled in something much bigger than just pulling an old man from a sinking car. He barely had time to process before Ryan showed up, knocking on his window like he always did when he had news or trouble. David rolled over, groaning, but Ryan knocked again, more insistently this time. "Come on, man, get up. We need to talk." David reluctantly got up, pulled on a hoodie over his t-shirt, and shoved the window open. "You know we have a front door, right?" Ryan smirked. "Yeah, but this feels more dramatic. Hurry up, dude. I've got something you're going to want to hear." David sighed but didn't argue. Within minutes, they were walking down the street toward town, Ryan's energy buzzing beside him. "Okay," David said finally, shoving his hands into his hoodie pocket. "What's so important you had to show up at my window like some kind of serial killer?" Ryan grinned, but quickly turned serious. "I was at the cafe this morning, and guess who I overheard talking?" David barely had to guess. Lily? Not just Lily, Claire Davidson. She was telling her that James had been keeping something hidden in his old workshop, something to do with Michael. David stopped walking. "Wait, you mean the workshop that's been locked up for years?" Ryan nodded. "Exactly. No one's been in there since James shut it down after Michael died. But Claire seemed pretty sure there was something in there. Something James didn't want anyone to find." David's stomach tightened. The idea of a hidden truth buried in the old workshop felt like confirmation that his instincts had been right all along. Whatever James had been trying to say that night, whatever secret he had kept for so long, it was tied to that place. Ryan glanced at him. "You're thinking what I'm thinking, aren't you?" David exhaled, glancing toward the road that led to the workshop. It sat at the edge of town, near the woods, a place most people didn't bother with anymore. "We need to get inside," David said. Ryan grinned. "Now you're talking." But neither of them had any idea that breaking into the old workshop wouldn't just uncover secrets from the past. It would also set off a chain reaction that neither of them could stop. The workshop stood at the far end of town, a long-forgotten building tucked behind the remnants of an old sawmill. The paint on the wooden siding had peeled away, revealing the gray, weathered surface beneath, and ivy had begun creeping up the walls, reclaiming what had been left abandoned for years. The large double doors, once a proud entrance to a thriving business, were now locked shut with rusted chains. A faded sign above the entrance still bore the name Hayes Woodworks, though the letters were barely legible after decades of exposure to the elements. David and Ryan stood a few yards away, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of activity. The town wasn't big, and news traveled fast. If they got caught trying to sneak into James Hayes's old shop, it wouldn't take long before someone started asking questions. But David wasn't about to walk away. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. Ryan was the first to move, stepping closer and testing the chain with a tug. "Rusty," he muttered. "Probably old as hell. If we had bolt cutters, this thing wouldn't stand a chance." David frowned. "Yeah, because bolt cutters wouldn't make us look suspicious or anything." Ryan grinned. "What? You think breaking and entering is a bad idea?" David rolled his eyes but moved closer, scanning the side of the building. There had to be another way in. The last thing he wanted was to cause any real damage. He just needed to see if there was something inside that could explain what James had tried to tell him. He ran a hand along the window nearest to the door, pressing against the frame. It didn't budge, but when he looked down, he noticed something odd. The lock on the window wasn't fully engaged. He glanced at Ryan. "Help me lift this." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Seriously?" "Just shut up and help." Ryan snorted but did as he was told, and together they pried the window open just enough for David to slip inside. He landed with a soft thud on the wooden floor, the air inside thick with the scent of sawdust and time. The workshop was exactly as he imagined it. Dust-covered tools still lined the walls. Wooden tables stood frozen in place, and unfinished projects sat untouched, as if waiting for someone to come back and complete them. But there was something else, too. A sense of absence. It wasn't just that James had left. It was as if something had been deliberately erased. David turned as Ryan climbed in after him, shaking off dust from his hoodie. "Creepy," Ryan muttered, his voice lower than usual, as if he too could feel the weight of the past hanging in the air. David ignored him and started moving through the room, his fingers running over the wooden surfaces, his eyes scanning every corner for anything that seemed out of place. If James had hidden something here, it wasn't going to be obvious. It had to be somewhere that no one would casually stumble upon. Ryan kicked at a pile of discarded wood shavings near one of the workbenches. So what exactly are we looking for? David wasn't sure. But then, as he reached the far side of the room, he spotted something. A cabinet. Unlike everything else, it wasn't coated in dust. It looked like it had been opened or touched recently. And that didn't make sense. David's pulse quickened. He reached out, fingers gripping the handle, and slowly pulled the cabinet door open. Inside, sitting in the dim light, was a wooden box, and it had James Hayes's initials carved into the lid. David stared at the wooden box, his fingers hovering over the lid as his mind raced with possibilities. The initials J.H. were carved deeply into the smooth surface, and although dust had settled around it, the edges of the lid looked clean, like someone had touched it recently. Which didn't make sense. James hadn't been in this workshop for years. No one had. At least, no one was supposed to have been. A strange feeling settled in his stomach, something between anticipation and unease. Ryan stepped up beside him, peering over his shoulder. "Well, open it." David hesitated. "What if it's nothing?" Ryan scoffed. "You really think James would stash some boring old box in a locked-up workshop for nothing?" "Dude, we just broke in here. If we leave without opening that thing, I'm going to be seriously disappointed." David swallowed, then carefully lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a layer of soft, aging fabric, was a stack of envelopes. Ryan let out a slow whistle. "Well, that's not what I was expecting." David picked up the first envelope, his hands steady despite the way his pulse had begun to hammer in his ears. It was yellowed with time, but the handwriting on the front was unmistakably Lily's. He didn't have to know her well to recognize the sharp, precise letters spelling out James Hayes. Ryan leaned closer. "Holy crap, are those—" "Letters," David murmured. "From Lily." There were at least a dozen, maybe more, stacked neatly, each one addressed to James. Some were sealed, others had clearly been opened, their edges slightly crumpled from being read and reread. But the thing that made David's breath catch was the last one, the one that had never been opened. His fingers brushed over it. The paper was brittle, the ink slightly smudged from age, but it was intact. James had never read it. Ryan exhaled sharply. This just got a whole lot more interesting. David felt the same way, but his focus was pulled elsewhere now. Beneath the stack of letters, hidden at the very bottom of the box, was something heavier, something solid. Carefully, he pushed the envelopes aside and lifted out a leather-bound journal. The moment he saw the name scrawled across the inside cover, his chest tightened. Michael Hayes. Ryan stiffened beside him. No way. David turned the first page, fingers trembling slightly. The handwriting was different from Lily's, messier but youthful, full of energy. The date at the top of the page was from more than 20 years ago. The last few words James had whispered to him flashed through David's mind. This was it. This was the key to everything. But as he skimmed the first few lines, his breath caught. Because what was written inside changed everything they thought they knew about Michael's death. David's hands gripped the edges of the worn leather journal, his pulse hammering as he turned the page. The ink was faded, the handwriting uneven, but the words were still legible. Michael's words. A first-hand account of something that had been buried for more than 2 decades. Ryan leaned in, reading over his shoulder. "What does it say?" David swallowed hard and began to read aloud. March 12th, 1999. "I don't know if I should be writing this, but I need to put it somewhere. If anything happens to me, I want someone to know the truth. Something isn't right. I think Daniel is lying about what he saw that night. I think he's hiding something. And I think my dad knows." David stopped, his throat dry. Ryan's eyes widened. "Wait. Daniel? Michael was suspicious of Daniel?" David didn't respond, flipping the pages instead, scanning for more. The entries were scattered, some pages torn or smudged, as if Michael had been hiding the journal and had written in it whenever he had the chance. Each entry seemed to revolve around the same thing, his growing suspicion that Daniel wasn't telling the truth about the night of his supposed drowning. April 5th, 1999. "Daniel keeps saying it was an accident, but I know what I saw. He was there before anyone else, but when the police asked him, he said he only came after." That's a lie. He knew something. He saw something. And he's trying to make sure no one ever finds out. David turned the page, his stomach twisting into knots. April 18th, 1999. "I confronted Daniel today. He told me to drop it, that it wouldn't matter soon anyway. I don't know what that means, but it scared me. He's never looked at me like that before. I told Dad, but he wouldn't listen. He said I was imagining things, that I was making it bigger than it was. But I'm not. I know what I saw." A chill ran down David's spine. He could feel the fear in Michael's words, the growing paranoia, the sense that he was getting closer to something dangerous. And then, suddenly, there was a gap. No entries for almost a month. The pages were blank, as if Michael had either stopped writing or something had happened. David flipped to the next filled-out page. May 3rd, 1999. "If something happens to me, it's not an accident. If they say I fell, if they say I drowned, it's not true. I wouldn't have gone near the lake that night unless someone made me. I need someone to believe me. I need someone to look deeper." David stopped breathing. Ryan was dead silent beside him, but when David finally looked at him, his friend's face was pale. "He knew," Ryan whispered. "Michael knew something was going to happen to him." David clenched his jaw, and no one ever saw this. They both looked back at the journal, its pages trembling slightly in David's hands. Michael Hayes had tried to warn someone, and no one had listened. Until now. David's hands trembled slightly as he closed the journal, his mind racing with what he had just read. The words burned into his brain, the weight of them settling like a stone in his chest. "If something happens to me, it's not an accident." Michael had known. He had felt it coming. And yet, for over 2 decades, the entire town had accepted the same version of the story, that he had drowned in Mirror Lake. Just an unfortunate accident. Another life taken too soon. But Michael's own words told a different truth, one that had been buried just like his journal. Ryan paced the dusty floor of the workshop, running a hand through his hair. "This is insane. I mean, we always knew Daniel was a grade A jerk. But this? You're telling me he was somehow involved in Michael's death, and everyone just ignored it?" David clenched his jaw, gripping the journal tighter. Not ignored, lied about. Think about it, Ryan. Michael told someone. He tried to tell James, and James brushed him off. He wrote it down, just in case. That means he was scared enough to believe something was going to happen. And then, it did. Ryan shook his head, exhaling sharply. Okay, but let's not jump to conclusions here. Even if Michael was suspicious of Daniel, that doesn't mean Daniel actually did something. He could have just been paranoid. David shot him a sharp look. You think he was paranoid? Ryan, he literally wrote that if they said he drowned, it was a lie. And what happened? They said he drowned. Ryan went quiet. He had no argument for that. David turned back to the wooden box, shifting aside the letters and the journal, searching for anything else. If Michael had left more clues, something that could prove what really happened that night, he needed to find it. But there was nothing else. Just aged paper and the weight of a secret that had been waiting years to be uncovered. We need to show this to Lily, David said firmly, closing the box. Ryan hesitated. Are you sure that's a good idea? She deserves to know. David looked at him, his expression hard. And more importantly, she might be the only person who can help us figure out what the hell really happened. Ryan blew out a breath. All right. But if this goes south, I'm blaming you. David didn't respond. He tucked the journal under his arm, feeling its weight like a pulse against his skin. He didn't know what Lily would do with the truth, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't letting Michael's words be ignored again. What none of them realized, though, was that someone else had been watching. Someone who had been waiting for years, hoping the past would stay buried. And now, they knew it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. The weight of the journal felt heavier in David's hands as he and Ryan made their way back toward town. The streets were quieter than usual, the storm from the night before having left the air damp and cool. Everything seemed normal, but David couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The past wasn't buried anymore. It had been dragged to the surface, and now there was no turning back. They reached the hospital just before noon, the scent of antiseptic and the hum of fluorescent lights making David's head pound the moment they stepped inside. He spotted Lily near the front desk, speaking with a doctor, her expression sharp but controlled. She always looked like she was holding something back, and now, after what they had found, David wondered how much she had been carrying all these years. As if sensing them, Lily turned, her gaze landing on the journal in David's hands. Her brows furrowed, and she took a step toward them, her heels clicking against the tile. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual, but edged with something unreadable. David exchanged a look with Ryan before answering. "The workshop." Lily's jaw tightened, but she didn't seem surprised. If anything, she looked like she had been expecting this. "Come with me." She led them down the hall, past the nurse's station, and into a private waiting room. The moment the door shut behind them, she turned to face them fully. "Tell me exactly what you found." David hesitated only for a second before handing her the journal. Lily took it carefully, flipping it open, her eyes scanning the pages. The moment she reached Michael's final entry, her fingers tensed against the paper. For a long time, she didn't say anything. Then, in a voice so controlled it barely sounded like her, she murmured, "He tried to tell someone." David nodded. And no one listened. Lily closed the journal, her grip so tight that her knuckles turned white. "My father knew," she whispered, not looking at them. "Michael told him, and he ignored it." David swallowed, unsure what to say. He wasn't good at dealing with this kind of thing. Grief, anger, the slow unraveling of everything someone thought they knew. But he knew what it was like to feel like no one was listening. And right now, that was the only thing keeping him standing here. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. So, what do we do now? Lily lifted her gaze, something hard and unreadable behind her eyes. We find out what really happened to my brother. David nodded. He had already known that was the next step. What he didn't know was how much danger they were walking into. Because secrets that had been buried for over 20 years weren't meant to be uncovered, and someone in Hendersonville was willing to do whatever it took to make sure they stayed buried. The decision had been made. They weren't going to walk away from this. Not now. David, Ryan, and Lily sat huddled in the small hospital waiting room, the journal lying open on the table between them like a ticking time bomb. The words on the pages had already changed everything. Michael had known something, and whatever it was, it had gotten him killed. The town had believed the official story for years, but Michael's final entries told the truth. He hadn't drowned by accident. Lily exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples as she leaned forward. If Daniel really was involved, that means someone helped him cover it up. Her voice was steady, but David could hear the tension beneath it. And not just my father. Someone else had to have kept the police from looking into it. David nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. Mayor Garrett. Ryan frowned. The mayor? You think he had something to do with it? David tapped the leather-bound journal. Think about it. If Michael really died under suspicious circumstances, the police should have investigated it. But they didn't. The case was closed almost immediately. That doesn't happen unless someone high up wants it buried. Lily's expression darkened. And Garrett has been in office for years, long enough to have had influence back then. Ryan let out a low whistle. So what? We're saying Daniel killed Michael, and the mayor helped him cover it up? That's insane. David shook his head. Not as insane as Michael's death being ruled an accident when he literally wrote that if something happened to him, it wasn't. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. We need proof. Something solid. Lily sat back, considering. We start with Daniel. He's the key to all of this. If he did something to Michael, then there's a chance he left loose ends. She looked between them. We need to find out what he's hiding. David already knew where this was going, and judging by Ryan's expression, so did he. You mean break into his office? Ryan said, lifting an eyebrow. Lily didn't blink. Exactly. David sighed. He had a feeling this was only going to get more dangerous. But they had come this far. There was no backing out now. Fine, he said. We'll find out what Daniel's been hiding. What none of them realized, as they solidified their plan, was that someone else had already realized they were getting too close. And that person was watching, waiting, ready to stop them before they uncovered the truth. The plan was risky, but it was the only real option they had. If Daniel had something to hide, then there had to be evidence somewhere. Something that had been overlooked for years. Something that could prove Michael's death wasn't an accident. David didn't like the idea of sneaking into Daniel's office, but he knew they didn't have time to wait around for answers. People like Daniel didn't just sit back and let their secrets get exposed. If he had been willing to lie about what happened to Michael, who knew what he'd do to protect himself now? The three of them left the hospital together, keeping their conversation low as they walked toward Ryan's truck. Lily had already called ahead and found out that Daniel's office was empty. He was meeting with investors out of town, which meant they had a few hours before he came back. Ryan kept glancing over at David as they drove, his fingers tapping anxiously against the steering wheel. You sure about this, man? Breaking into an old workshop is one thing. But this? If we get caught messing with Daniel's office, we're not just looking at a slap on the wrist. David knew the risks. They all did. But he couldn't shake the feeling that if they didn't act now, they might never get another chance. I know, he admitted. But if we back off now, we let them win. We let Michael's name stay buried. And we let Daniel keep whatever he's been hiding for years. Ryan exhaled sharply, nodding. Yeah, okay. Just making sure you're still thinking straight. They parked a few blocks away from Daniel's real estate office. Far enough not to draw attention, but close enough for a quick escape if things went south. The building was dark, the blinds closed, the whole place quiet. Exactly what they needed. Lily was the first to move, her movements smooth and deliberate as she led them toward the side entrance. She had grown up in this town just like they had, and even though she had spent years away, she still knew the ins and outs of places like this. She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a small piece of metal, a tension wrench. David's eyebrows lifted. You know how to pick locks? Lily didn't look at him as she knelt beside the door handle, sliding the tool into place. When you live in a city long enough, you learn a few things. Ryan chuckled. Remind me never to leave you alone near my car. Lily didn't respond. A second later, there was a soft click, and the door creaked open. They slipped inside quickly, shutting the door behind them. The office was dark except for the faint glow from the streetlights outside. It was clean, sterile, exactly what David had expected from someone like Daniel. Expensive furniture, framed certificates on the walls, everything placed just so. The man was meticulous, calculated. Lily moved first, heading straight for the desk. Start looking, she murmured. Anything that stands out. David and Ryan split up, scanning the room. Filing cabinets, a bookshelf lined with neatly stacked documents, a locked drawer in the desk, one that Lily was already working on. David moved toward the cabinets, scanning the labels. Most of them were exactly what he expected. Client contracts, property deeds, old records. But then, toward the back, something caught his eye. A thin folder, barely noticeable, stuffed between two larger files. The label was faded, but when he pulled it free, he felt his stomach clench. The name on the folder was Michael Hayes. Guys, he whispered. I found something. Ryan and Lily were at his side in seconds. Lily took the folder from his hands, flipping it open. Inside were police reports, witness statements, everything from the original investigation into Michael's death. But something was wrong. Some of the pages were missing. Others had been blacked out, information redacted. This isn't right, Lily murmured, her eyes scanning the documents. This isn't the full file. It's been edited. David's pulse pounded. Someone had gone through this file, had removed things, had changed things, which meant there was more that someone didn't want them to see. And then the office phone rang. All three of them froze. The phone rang again, the shrill sound cutting through the silence. Ryan looked at David, whispering, "No one's supposed to be here." David's chest tightened. They needed to leave. Now Lily closed the folder, slipping it under her coat. They had what they came for, proof that someone had tampered with the truth. They turned to leave, but just as they reached the door, a shadow moved outside the window. David's breath caught. Someone was watching them. David's heartbeat slammed against his ribs as he froze in place. The shadow outside the window shifted slightly, barely visible against the dim glow of the streetlights. Someone was out there, watching them, waiting. His mind raced through the possibilities. Had Daniel come back early? Had someone seen them enter the office? Or worse, had their search triggered some kind of silent alarm? Lily grabbed his arm, her voice low but firm. "We need to move. Now." David swallowed hard and nodded, his grip tightening on the folder beneath his jacket. Ryan was already one step ahead, quietly shutting the filing cabinet and backing toward the rear exit. They couldn't risk going out the front, not when someone was watching. The office suddenly felt suffocating, the air thick with the weight of what they had just uncovered. The tampered police reports, the missing documents. Someone had buried the truth about Michael's death, and that someone knew they were looking. Ryan reached the back door and hesitated only long enough to glance through the small window above the handle. "Looks clear," he whispered, then slowly turned the knob. The door creaked slightly as it swung open. They slipped outside, moving quickly into the alley behind the office. The air was cold, the damp scent of rain clinging to the pavement. The street beyond was quiet, but that didn't mean they were safe. David's mind was still racing as they darted through the alley, keeping to the shadows. He kept expecting to hear footsteps behind them, for someone to call out, to chase after them. But the only sound was their own hurried breathing and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. When they finally reached Ryan's truck, parked several blocks away, they barely stopped to catch their breath before piling in. Ryan started the engine, his hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. "That was way too close," he muttered, pulling away from the curb. David didn't disagree. His heart was still hammering, the adrenaline refusing to settle. He glanced at Lily, who was staring straight ahead, her expression unreadable. But when she spoke, her voice was sharp and steady. "We need to go somewhere safe. Somewhere we can actually go through these files." David knew she was right. They couldn't just run home and spread everything out on the kitchen table, not when someone was clearly trying to keep this buried. Ryan exhaled. "The workshop?" David shook his head. "Number. If someone saw us at the office, they'll be watching for where we go next." Lily turned toward him, her gaze steady. "Then where?" David hesitated, then made his decision. "Claire's Cafe. She knew Michael. She knew James. And if anyone in this town is willing to help us, it's her." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "You sure we can trust her?" David nodded. "We don't have a choice." Ryan didn't argue. He turned the truck toward the cafe, tires humming against the pavement. None of them noticed the black car that pulled onto the street behind them, its headlights staying just dim enough to avoid suspicion. Someone was following them. The tension in the truck was suffocating, an unspoken weight pressing down on all three of them. David's hands were clenched in his lap, his mind running through every possibility. Who had been outside Daniel's office? Had they seen them take the files? And more importantly, how far would they go to make sure those files never saw the light of day? Lily sat stiffly in the passenger seat, the stolen folder hidden beneath her coat. She wasn't saying much, but David could see the way her fingers tapped against her knee. A controlled restlessness that told him she was thinking just as fast as he was. Ryan drove in silence, his grip tight on the wheel. The glow of the streetlights flickered over his face as they passed through town, the roads mostly empty this late at night. He glanced at the rearview mirror once, then twice, his expression shifting. David caught the movement. "What?" Ryan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he changed lanes, slowed slightly, then sped up again. He checked the mirror one more time before exhaling sharply. "We've got company." David twisted in his seat, peering through the back window. At first, he didn't see anything unusual, just a few distant headlights in the darkness. But then he noticed it. The black car, It wasn't tailgating them, but it was there, keeping its distance, never falling too far behind. Lily saw it too. How long? Ryan's jaw clenched. Since we left the office, I think. I wasn't sure at first, but they've made every turn we have. David's pulse pounded. What do we do? Lily's voice was calm, too calm. We don't go to Claire's. Ryan nodded. Agreed. If they know we took something, they'll be watching to see where we take it. David thought fast. So where do we go? Ryan hesitated. Somewhere public. Somewhere they can't try anything without witnesses. The gas station, Lily said immediately. The one on Main Street. It's open all night. Always has at least a few people inside. Ryan didn't argue. He took the next turn, veering toward Main Street, making it look casual, like they were just going about their night. The black car followed. David's stomach twisted. Someone really didn't want them looking into this. They pulled into the gas station lot, the bright fluorescent lights overhead making it feel like a stark contrast to the shadowed streets they had just driven through. Ryan parked near the entrance, where the attendant behind the counter could clearly see them. The black car didn't stop. It drove past, slow and deliberate, before disappearing around the corner. David exhaled, but his nerves didn't settle. They're not gone, he murmured, just watching from somewhere else. Lily didn't move for a moment, then turned to look at him. Which means we don't have much time. They climbed out of the truck, walking into the gas station as casually as possible. The place was nearly empty except for a trucker sipping coffee in the corner and the bored-looking cashier behind the counter. Ryan grabbed a couple of water bottles from the fridge, acting normal, while David and Lily found a booth near the back. She pulled out the folder, laying it flat on the table between them. David scanned the contents again. The police reports, the witness statements, all of it had been altered. Entire sections were missing. Dates didn't match up, and there were discrepancies in Daniel's original testimony. The file had been manipulated. Lily pointed to one page in particular. Look at this. The report says Michael's body was recovered 2 hours after he drowned. But she flipped to another section. The coroner's report lists his time of death as 4 hours after he was last seen at the lake. David frowned. So he was still alive after they said he drowned? Lily nodded. At least for a while. Ryan slid into the booth across from them, lowering his voice. So what does that mean? That he was taken somewhere first? That someone let him die instead of helping him? David's stomach churned. Or worse, Lily met his gaze. That someone made sure he didn't survive. A heavy silence settled over them. The implications were clear. Michael hadn't just drowned. He had been left to die. Or worse, killed, and someone had worked hard to make sure that truth never came out. Ryan let out a low breath. Okay, so we know the reports were altered. We know Daniel lied. And we know Michael was still alive long after the official story said he wasn't. But we don't have proof that Daniel actually did anything. Lily nodded slowly. Not yet. David flipped through the documents again, desperate for something, anything, that could connect the dots. And then he saw it. A name, buried in the fine print of a witness report. Ryan noticed the shift in his expression. What? David tapped the paper. This name. Look, Lily leaned in, reading aloud. John Bishop, reported seeing a car near the lake that night, but no official follow-up. Ryan frowned. Bishop? As in Eli Bishop's dad? David's pulse picked up. Eli Bishop had been a cop in Hendersonville years ago. Everyone knew that. His father, John, had lived in town all his life. A quiet man who mostly kept to himself. If he had seen something that night, If he had seen who was with Michael before he died, then he might know the truth. Lily sat back, thinking. If John Bishop saw something, we need to talk to him. Ryan snorted. Yeah, good luck with that. The guy barely talks to his neighbors. Why would he tell us anything? David clenched his jaw. Because we have something he doesn't know we have. Michael's journal. And if he really saw something that night, then he might be the only person who can tell us what we're missing. Lily met his gaze. Then we find him. Ryan hesitated, then let out a breath. Fine. But if this guy slams the door in our faces, don't say I didn't warn you. David didn't care. They were closer than they had ever been. And for the first time, he had the distinct feeling that they weren't just unraveling an old mystery. They were digging into something people had killed to keep hidden. And if they weren't careful, they might be next. The road to John Bishop's house was long and winding, cutting through the wooded outskirts of town where the streetlights thinned and the world felt quieter, heavier. David sat in the back seat of Ryan's truck, gripping Michael's journal tightly as he stared out at the darkened trees blurring past. Lily sat in the front, her posture stiff, fingers drumming lightly against her knee. No one had spoken much since they left the gas station. They all knew this was their best lead yet. But they also knew that if John Bishop had seen something the night Michael died, and he had kept quiet for all these years, there had to be a reason. Ryan turned onto the last stretch of road, where the trees thinned enough to reveal a small, weathered house at the end of a long driveway. A single porch light glowed against the night, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. The place looked old but lived in, a house that had been standing long before any of them were born. Ryan pulled up and killed the engine. No one moved. You sure about this? Ryan asked, gripping the wheel. If this guy didn't talk to the cops back then, what makes you think he's going to talk to us? David swallowed hard, his eyes still locked on the porch. Because we have Michael's words, and if he really saw something, maybe he's been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Lily didn't hesitate. She opened her door and stepped out, her boots crunching against the gravel. David followed, clutching the journal under his arm, and Ryan sighed before climbing out behind them. The house was silent except for the distant chirp of crickets and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. When they reached the porch, David hesitated for only a second before rapping his knuckles against the door. A long pause. Then, movement inside. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approached the door. A lock clicked. The door creaked open just enough to reveal John Bishop's sharp, lined face, his eyes squinting slightly against the porch light as he studied them. He was older than David remembered, but still strong-looking despite his age, his frame solid beneath a worn flannel shirt. His expression was unreadable. "What do you want?" His voice was rough, edged with impatience. David's grip on the journal tightened. "We need to talk about Michael Hayes." John's face didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. A shadow, a hesitation. Then, without a word, he started to close the door. Lily stepped forward before it could shut completely. "We know you saw something that night." John's hand froze on the doorframe. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Then, after what felt like forever, John exhaled through his nose, pushed the door open wider, and stepped back. "Come in," he said. And just like that, the past cracked open. David stepped inside first, gripping Michael's journal tightly as his eyes adjusted to the dim lighting. The house smelled faintly of old wood and tobacco, with a cluttered but lived-in feel. piles of newspapers stacked on the coffee table, a well-worn recliner near the fireplace, and a small kitchen visible through an open archway. The walls were lined with faded photographs, some framed, others pinned haphazardly. Many of them were old, black and white images of the town, of people David didn't recognize. But what caught his attention was the small framed picture near the television. A young Michael Hayes, smiling, frozen in time. John Bishop shut the door behind them, locking it with a quiet click before walking past them into the living room. He gestured vaguely toward the worn-out couch. "Sit," he muttered, though it didn't sound like an invitation, more like an obligation. David sat stiffly, Lily beside him. Ryan hesitated before dropping into the armchair across from John, who lowered himself into his recliner with a slow, tired movement. His sharp eyes flickered between them, lingering a second longer on Lily before he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're James's girl," he said gruffly. "Haven't seen you around in years." Lily's face remained impassive. "I've been busy." John let out a small, humorless chuckle. "That's one way to put it." He shifted his gaze to David. "And you're the kid who pulled James out of the lake." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Guess that means you're either real brave or real stupid." David's fingers curled around the edges of the journal. "Maybe both." John grunted, but there was the faintest flicker of approval in his expression. He leaned back, folding his arms. "So, you came all this way to talk about Michael?" Lily nodded, her voice steady. "We found his journal." John stiffened, his eyes darkening in a way that sent a chill down David's spine. For a long moment, he didn't speak, just stared at the three of them like he was trying to figure out whether they were a threat or a problem. Then, he let out a slow breath. "I knew this day would come," he muttered, shaking his head. "I just didn't know who'd be the ones knocking." David exchanged a quick glance with Lily and Ryan before turning back to John. "Michael wrote that he didn't drown by accident, that if something happened to him, it wasn't an accident." He hesitated before adding, "And he wrote about you. That you saw something that night. Something no one ever followed up on." John was quiet for a long time. Too long. Then finally he spoke. "I saw more than I should have," he said, his voice lower now. "And I kept my mouth shut for a reason." David felt his pulse quicken. "Because of Daniel?" John's eyes flashed. He didn't confirm it outright, but the silence that followed was enough. Lily leaned forward, her fingers digging into her knees. "Tell us the truth," she said quietly. "What happened that night?" John sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. When he looked back up, his expression was heavier, as if something long buried had finally surfaced, whether he wanted it to or not. "I was out late," he began. "Couldn't sleep, so I went for a drive. Ended up near the lake, didn't think much of it. Just parked, sat there for a while. Then I saw a car, a black sedan. No headlights, rolling slow. I knew something wasn't right." David's breath caught. "You saw who was inside?" John nodded grimly. "Daniel Hayes and Michael." Lily's face paled. "Michael was still alive?" John's jaw tightened. "Yeah, he was standing by the water, looked nervous. Daniel was talking to him, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. Then Michael turned to walk away, and that's when Daniel grabbed him." Ryan sucked in a sharp breath. What?" John's expression darkened. "I didn't realize what was happening at first. Thought they were just arguing, but then Daniel shoved him. Hard. Michael lost his balance, fell backward into the lake." The room was dead silent. David felt like he couldn't breathe. "You saw him push Michael into the water?" John nodded. "He went under, came back up, but he was struggling, panicking. And Daniel, he just stood there, watched him. His hands curled into fists. I should have done something. I should have gotten out of my car, but I was frozen. I kept telling myself I wasn't seeing what I was seeing, and by the time I snapped out of it, it was too late." Lily's voice was barely above a whisper. "You mean Michael drowned?" John's face hardened. "No." His next words sent a shiver down David's spine. "Michael made it to shore. He crawled onto the bank, coughing up water, barely able to stand." David's mind raced. "Then how?" John's eyes locked onto his. "Because Daniel didn't let him leave." The silence in the room turned suffocating. Lily looked like she might be sick. She swallowed hard. "He killed him?" John exhaled slowly. "I saw him kneel down, heard him say something. Then he put his hands around Michael's neck." His voice was tight, like the words were choking him. Michael was already weak. He didn't stand a chance. Ryan cursed under his breath, dragging a hand down his face. David's hands were shaking. Michael had made it out of the water. He had been alive. He had a chance. And Daniel had taken it from him. John looked at them, his face weary. "I should have stopped him. I should have done something." But by the time I finally got out of my car, Daniel was dragging Michael's body back into the lake. When I realized what he was doing, I panicked. I left. His voice cracked slightly. "And I never told anyone." David's chest ached with the weight of those words. "Why?" John let out a humorless laugh. "Because I was a coward. Because Daniel's family had power in this town, and I knew no one would believe me. And because the next morning, before I could even think about going to the cops, Mayor Garrett came to my house, told me he knew I had been at the lake, and told me to forget everything I saw." Lily's head snapped up. "The mayor?" John nodded grimly. "He covered it up, helped Daniel make it look like an accident." He leaned back, rubbing his face. "And I let them. I let them bury Michael's truth." David felt like he was drowning in the weight of it all. They had known Daniel was involved. But the mayor? That changed everything. Lily stood abruptly. "We need to go. We need to get this to the police." John let out a slow breath. "Won't do you any good. Garrett still has influence. And Daniel? He won't let this come out without a fight." David clenched his fists. "Then we make sure he doesn't have a choice." John studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then you'd better be ready for what's coming." Because secrets this deep didn't stay buried without a reason. And Daniel Hayes was about to find out what happened when the truth finally came to the surface. The weight of John Bishop's confession sat heavily on David's chest as they drove away from his house, the night feeling darker, heavier than before. The truth had finally surfaced, raw and undeniable. Michael Hayes hadn't drowned by accident. He had been murdered. And Daniel Hayes, with the help of Mayor Garrett, had spent the last 2 decades burying that truth. Ryan kept glancing in the rearview mirror, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "We need to be smart about this," he muttered. "We can't just walk into the police station and hand over a bunch of papers and a witness statement and expect them to take down Daniel and Garrett overnight." Lily sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her fingers gripping her coat so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. "Then what do you suggest?" Her voice was sharp, controlled, but David could hear the underlying tremor. Ryan exhaled, shaking his head. We go public, all of it. We get it to the press, make sure it's too big to ignore. If Garrett still has influence over the police, we can't trust them to act fast enough. But the town? The town won't ignore this. Not if we make enough noise. David thought about that. He knew Ryan was right. Daniel and Garrett had managed to control the narrative for years, manipulating official reports, silencing witnesses like John. But if the people of Hendersonville found out, if the truth spread before Daniel and Garrett had time to react, they'll try to stop us, Lily said quietly. If they realize what we're doing, they'll do everything in their power to shut us down before it goes public. David nodded. Then we don't give them the chance. He turned to Ryan. We need to make copies of everything. The journal, the files we took from Daniel's office, John's testimony. Multiple copies, hidden in multiple places. If they try to come after us, we make sure the truth is already out there. Ryan sighed but nodded. I know someone who can help with that. I'll handle the copies. Lily straightened, her gaze steely. I'll call in a few favors. There's a journalist I know. Someone who actually cares about exposing corruption. If we can get them to take this story, Daniel and Garrett won't be able to sweep it under the rug. David swallowed, gripping the journal tightly. Then we move fast. We get this out before they even realize what's happening. But as they turned onto the main road, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. Bright. Close. Ryan stiffened. We're being followed. Lily turned, her eyes narrowing as she caught sight of the black SUV tailing them. It wasn't just following, it was closing in. Fast. David's stomach clenched. They know. Ryan cursed under his breath, slamming his foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, tires screeching against the asphalt as the SUV picked up speed behind them. This wasn't just intimidation. They were coming for them. Ryan gritted his teeth, hands clenching the wheel as he pushed the truck faster. The dark road ahead twisted through the outskirts of town, lined with dense trees, the shadows making it feel like they were driving straight into a trap. The SUV behind them didn't back off. It surged forward, its engine roaring as it closed the distance, headlights flooding the cabin with blinding light. Hold on, Ryan growled, yanking the wheel to the right. The truck veered off the main road, tires skidding as they barreled onto a smaller side street, kicking up gravel and dirt. David braced himself, gripping the dashboard as his heart pounded. Lily's breath was steady but sharp, her eyes locked on the rearview mirror. They're still coming, she said tightly. David twisted around in his seat, stomach lurching as he saw the SUV closing in, fast. The road was too narrow, the trees too close. If they didn't lose them soon, they'd be trapped. Ryan slammed the gas pedal. We need to get to a crowded area, somewhere public. The bridge, David said suddenly. If we can make it there, we can get onto the main highway. Ryan nodded, yanking the wheel hard left. The truck swerved dangerously, nearly tipping as they hit the curve at high speed, the tires barely gripping the wet pavement. The SUV didn't slow. It was gaining on them, inches away from their back bumper. Then, impact. A jolt shot through the truck as the SUV slammed into them from behind, sending them lurching forward. The force knocked David against his seatbelt, air leaving his lungs in a rush. "They're trying to run us off the road!" Ryan shouted. David barely had time to react before the SUV rammed them again, harder this time. The truck fishtailed, tires shrieking against the pavement as Ryan fought for control. They were dangerously close to the guardrail now, the edge of the road falling off into a steep slope below. David's mind spun. If they went over the edge, they were dead. "Hit the brakes!" Lily snapped. "What?" Ryan barked. "Now!" Ryan didn't hesitate. He slammed the brakes. The sudden stop sent the truck skidding violently, but the SUV had no time to react. It shot forward, unable to slow in time. And that's when Ryan yanked the wheel to the side, narrowly dodging impact. The SUV flew past them, losing control as it veered toward the guardrail. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The SUV slammed into the metal barrier. A sickening screech filled the air as the guardrail buckled, then snapped. The vehicle tipped forward, its weight carrying it over the edge. And then, in a blink, it was gone, plummeting down into the trees below. Silence. Only the sound of their heavy breathing filled the truck's cabin. David's hands were shaking. His pulse was thunderous in his ears. Ryan exhaled shakily, gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles were white. "Holy—" "Drive," Lily cut in sharply, her voice like steel. "Now." Ryan snapped out of his daze and hit the gas, peeling away from the scene as fast as the truck would allow. David turned, watching as the twisted wreckage of the SUV disappeared behind them into the darkness. His stomach churned. They hadn't won. Whoever had been in that car, they hadn't been alone in this. And now Daniel and Garrett would know that they were fighting back. Lily ran a hand through her hair, exhaling through her nose. "They tried to kill us." Ryan let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah, no kidding." David stared straight ahead, his grip tightening on Michael's journal. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Lily's gaze flickered toward him. "No," she murmured. "It's just beginning." And they had just made themselves the biggest targets in Hendersonville. The truck sped down the highway, the town lights fading behind them as Ryan pushed the engine harder. The adrenaline still coursed through David's veins, his mind racing to process what had just happened. Someone had tried to stop them, not just intimidate them, but make sure they didn't dig any deeper. The wrecked SUV now lay somewhere in the trees, but this wasn't over. It wouldn't be over until the truth about Michael Hayes finally came to light. Lily sat silently in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, her breathing controlled, but tense. David could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers dug into the fabric of her coat. She had spent years running from this town, from the past, and now it had come crashing back. Ryan was the first to break the silence. "Where are we going?" David thought for a second. They couldn't go home. Not now. "Claire's Cafe," he said finally. "We need to regroup, figure out our next move." Ryan hesitated. "You sure?" "If they knew we were digging around in Daniel's office, they might guess we'd go there." David clenched his jaw. "We don't have a choice. Claire is the only person in this town who might actually help us." Ryan sighed but nodded, turning onto the road that led back toward town. The cafe was nearly empty when they arrived. The neon open sign buzzed faintly in the window. The warm glow of the interior, a stark contrast to the cold, dangerous night outside. Claire Davidson stood behind the counter, wiping down a coffee mug when they entered. Her sharp eyes flickered toward them, immediately catching the way they looked, soaking wet, shaken, and carrying a tension that couldn't be ignored. She set the mug down. "What the hell happened to you three?" Lily didn't waste time. She walked straight to the counter and placed the stolen folder on it. "We have proof," she said, her voice firm. "Michael didn't drown by accident." Claire's expression barely shifted, but David saw the way her fingers curled slightly against the countertop. "Go to the back," she said quietly. Now, they followed her into the storeroom. a small, dimly lit space filled with bags of coffee beans and old chairs stacked against the walls. Claire locked the door behind them, then turned, her gaze sharper than ever. "Talk," David exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "We broke into Daniel's office. We found the original police reports. Michael's death was covered up, and John Bishop, he saw what happened that night." Claire's jaw tightened. "And what did he say?" David swallowed hard. Michael made it to shore. He was alive. But something happened after that, and the real story was hidden. Silence. Claire closed her eyes briefly, as if she had already suspected it, but never had the proof. When she opened them again, they were filled with something colder. Determination. "You're planning to go public with this," she stated. Lily nodded. "We don't have a choice." Claire studied them, then exhaled. "Then you'd better be ready for what's coming." David's stomach churned. They were already in too deep, but there was no turning back now. Claire leaned against the counter, her eyes scanning the documents spread before her. The weight of the truth was clear in her expression. "You're sure about this?" Lily nodded. Michael's journal, the altered police reports, John Bishop's statement, it all points to the same thing. The truth was buried. Claire exhaled, rubbing her temple. "If you go public, you need to be smart. If Daniel and Mayor Garrett have covered this up for years, they won't just sit back and let it unravel." Ryan crossed his arms. "We figured that out the hard way." Claire looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" David hesitated. "Someone followed us from Daniel's office. They tried to force us off the road." Claire stiffened. "And you're standing here like that's normal?" Lily's voice was calm but firm. "We don't have time to be afraid. We need to act before they do." Claire studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll call a friend at the local paper. If we're doing this, we're making it public fast." David felt his pulse quicken. They were finally taking control. But as they left the cafe, a single thought lingered. Daniel and Garrett wouldn't go down without a fight. The morning air in Hendersonville was tense, a quiet unease settling over the town. Word had spread. Claire's article had gone live at dawn, exposing everything. The cover-up, the altered reports, John Bishop's testimony. The truth was no longer a buried secret. David sat on the edge of his bed, Michael's journal resting in his lap. It felt strange knowing that after all this time, Michael's voice had finally been heard. He had feared no one would believe him, that his warnings would die with him. But now, everyone knew the truth. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Anna stood there, worry in her eyes. "The police are at the cafe," she said quietly. "They're arresting Daniel." David's stomach twisted. He grabbed his jacket and rushed outside, barely hearing Ryan's truck pull up next to him. "Get in," Ryan called. "You're going to want to see this." They drove through town, the streets unusually packed as people gathered near Claire's cafe. Hendersonville was a small town. Big news like this didn't stay quiet for long. When they arrived, they saw him, Daniel Hayes, standing in handcuffs, his face pale with anger. Two officers flanked him as they guided him toward a police car. Mayor Garrett stood nearby, his expression unreadable, but there was no mistaking the tension in his jaw. Lily was already there, standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed. She didn't speak, didn't move. She just watched as Daniel was put into the back seat of the cruiser. As the police car pulled away, she finally exhaled. It's over. But David knew the truth. It wasn't over. Not really. The town had changed. The past had been unearthed. And now, they had to figure out how to move forward. The crowd slowly dispersed, murmurs filling the air as people processed what had just happened. Daniel was gone, taken into custody, and Mayor Garrett stood alone, his power slipping away by the second. The town had turned against them. The truth had won. David turned to Lily. What happens now? She let out a slow breath. Michael finally gets justice. Her voice was steady, but there was a softness in her eyes, a quiet relief. Claire approached, nodding toward the retreating police car. It's not just Daniel. The state investigators are reopening the case. Garrett won't be mayor much longer. Ryan grinned. So we actually did it. David looked down at Michael's journal in his hands, running his fingers over the worn leather cover. It wasn't just them. Michael had fought for the truth long before they did, and now his story was no longer hidden. Lily glanced at the sky, the morning sun breaking through the fading storm clouds. It's time to move forward. David nodded. For the first time in a long time, Hendersonville felt different, lighter, honest, and for the first time, Michael Hayes could finally rest in peace.